So today's video is going to be a bit different from the ones that precede it and the ones that follow it. It's about politics, but it's not about a particular political story or a new development in an ongoing political narrative. It's about partisanship. Partisanship as it relates to this channel, and why I think it's not only okay to be partisan in today's political climate, I don't think it's possible to be a good faith, informed, nonpartisan in today's political climate. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. So, why am I talking about partisanship? Well, if you follow my content, if you follow me on Twitter, if you see me on Reddit, you'll see that I'm very critical of enlightened centrists and enlightened moderates and people who profess to be nonpartisan. And they, in turn, have quite a few criticisms for me. They say I'm too partisan, I'm too divisive, I don't appreciate that both sides have their pros and cons, and it's a bit more complicated than one side being preferable to the other. And so, given the increasing frequency of these exchanged criticisms, I thought I'd make a video about this as kind of a handy reference tool to people who don't quite understand my position and why I say the things I say and why I believe the things I believe. So, spoiler alert, I am partisan. I am unapologetically partisan. And the reason that I am unapologetically partisan is because I've evaluated the two parties in question, and I've concluded that one is preferable to the other. I am a progressive Democrat. I've considered the things I want out of the world, what I'd like the world to be, how politics can effectuate that, actualize that, and then I've compared the two parties. I look at their record, their rhetoric, their values, their ethics, their policies, their positions, their politicians, their representatives. And what I've concluded, generally speaking, is that the Democratic Party is preferable to the Republican Party. The progressive left is preferable to the regressive right. Now, to be clear, just because I'm a partisan progressive Democrat, that does not mean that I think that Democrats are perfect. They're not. They never were. They never will be. It doesn't mean that I don't think that we should scrutinize and criticize Democrats when they get things wrong. We should. It also doesn't mean that I think that the progressive left has all the answers to all the problems. I just think that generally speaking, they have more answers to the problems and better answers to the problems. That's it. It's just a preference. And also, to be clear, I understand why so many other political commentators, many of whom are much more successful than me, will say that they're nonpartisan. Now, well, I guess I can't say for certain. I can speculate. They're either lying for a reason or they're deluded. But I do understand that to a lot of people, the appearance of nonpartisanship, or the claim, rather, of nonpartisanship, affords a person a degree of credibility. Almost like they're enlightened, they're above petty partisan politics and team sports. They're able to scale the peak of enlightened centrism and look at the terrain and see the peaks and the valleys and the obstacles. And that may work for geography, but that's not how politics works, okay? So just to be upfront, I am partisan, unapologetically so. And that's also not to say that I hate conservatives or that I hate Republicans. I grew up in a red rural state. I was born in a red rural state. I live to this day in a red state. Most of my family members and friends and acquaintances are conservative and vote Republican. I don't hate them. I love them. Do I disagree with them? Yes. Am I often frustrated with them? Sure. Do I think I am better politically informed than they are? Absolutely. But I don't hate them. My disdain is for Republican politicians and conservative thought leaders, people who do this professionally, people who have the resources and the time and the training to know better and still lead others to bad politics. That's where my disdain is. For people like Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, Tim Pool, Steven Crowder, etc., and so forth. Those are the people I have disdain for, okay? So with that in mind, I just want to say this. If you disagree with my partisan conclusions or my partisanship in general, then I would invite you to challenge me on the facts. Because again, whether you like it or not, I am partisan because, as I understand it, I've evaluated the facts and they have led inevitably to a partisan conclusion, okay? If you disagree, feel free to challenge me on the facts. Maybe I've got the facts wrong. I don't think so, but perhaps I do. The frustrating thing is very often when I get criticism of partisanship, people overwhelmingly don't challenge me on the facts. So when I say that Democrats are better stewards of the economy based on their record, most people don't challenge me on that. They just don't like the conclusion. So when I say that, since the end of the Cold War, 45 million jobs have been created and 43 million were created under Democratic presidents, most people don't challenge that. When I say GDP growth is almost twice over the past 60 years under Democratic, twice as great under Democratic administrations than Republicans, most people don't challenge that. When I say 10 out of the last 11 recessions began under Republican administrations, most people don't challenge that. When we turn to social issues, when I say that the modern Democratic Party has a better social agenda in terms of equality for women and trans people and gay people and so on and so forth, most people don't challenge that. They just don't like the conclusion. And I don't have much patience for that. It would be dishonest, it would be irrational to pretend that I'm not partisan if the facts lend themselves to a partisan conclusion. The problem is, I think too many people think that there's some sort of divine cosmic law. It's almost like the golden means fallacy, right? Where the truth and the correct answer to everything is in the dead center between two sides. Well, it's just not true. It's a fallacy for a reason. And somewhere along the way, people have forfeited their right or their ability to recognize meaningful distinctions between two things when it comes to politics, even though they do it all the time in any other situation. Like when you go to buy a car, if you're comparing two cars, and you look at like the Kelley Blue Book value and like the consumer reports and things like that, and one car is rated better than the other car, you don't go, oh, it's a coin flip, right? When you go to eat something, right? Even if your options aren't like ideal, right? So maybe I don't like meatloaf. But if somebody offers me a plate of meatloaf and my alternative is a plate of dog feces, I'm going to eat the meatloaf. And it doesn't mean I love the meatloaf. It just means I would prefer the meatloaf to the alternative. We're usually able to do these things. We're usually able to recognize fundamental, meaningful distinctions and create preferences. Think about criminals. There's so many crimes out there. If we're comparing two criminals and one is a carjacker and the other one is an axe murderer, would we just say, well, they're both criminals and that's it? That's the end of the analysis? No, we wouldn't, right? It would technically be true, but it would not be the most true. It would not be the most precise or the most helpful. We would say, okay, they're both criminals, but one is considerably worse than the other, the axe murderer, right? We'd be able to do that. We do this in history and politics all the time. When we look at the Civil War and we compare the Confederacy and the Union, we recognize that yeah, maybe Abraham Lincoln did accrue executive power. Maybe that made people uncomfortable. But that's nowhere near as morally egregious to what Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy were wanting to do with respect to maintaining and expanding the franchise of slavery. The Confederacy was clearly worse, much worse, and we can recognize that. The Second World War, we don't say, okay, well, sure, Hitler killed 12 million people during the Holocaust, but you know what? President Roosevelt interred tens or hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans. And therefore Roosevelt and Hitler are equally bad. No. We can say that Roosevelt did bad things and criticize those things without putting him on an equal moral footing to Adolf Hitler. We can recognize fundamental, meaningful, important distinctions between two things. We can say cancer sucks, but stage 4 cancer is worse than stage 1 cancer. We can say that just sickness sucks in period, but any stage of cancer is worse than the common cold. We can recognize these things. Why can't we do that? Why can't some of us do it with politics? And against one thing, if you disagree with the facts, or if the facts lend themselves to a more symmetrical political playing field. But they don't, at least not as I understand them. I think too often people are uncomfortable with the commitment associated with a political preference. And I get it. I've had conversations with centrists and moderates and nonpartisans my entire life. There have even been times I've indulged it, either just maybe even to avoid the inevitable argument. Again, I grew up in a red rural state. Most of my family members and friends are conservatives. Don't you think I've been at Thanksgiving dinners where people complain about Democrats and I might criticize a Republican, but then say, well, both sides, to try to calm tensions? I understand why people do it. It's non-committal. You're less likely to invoke somebody's hatred or a visceral response if they know that if you disagree with somebody politically, but they also know that you have some sort of disdain or contempt for the people they don't like, right? I understand the appeal of performative nonpartisanship. But today's political climate really doesn't lend itself well to that. The modern Republican Party is an authoritarian cult of personality. And listen, again, that's not to say that I hate conservative voters. It's just not true. I love many conservative voters. Again, most of the people in my life are conservative voters, if they're eligible voters at all. As a matter of fact, conservatives are very often victims of Republican policy, just as much as other groups, right? When you look at the poorest, least educated, least healthy, most federally reliant states in this country, most of them are overwhelmingly Republican-led. Republican policies don't do favors for anybody except for a very small number of super rich people. That's where we are. But when it comes to partisanship, it's okay to be partisan. Specifically, it's okay to be leftly partisan because the facts lend themselves to a left-leaning partisan conclusion. Stephen Colbert once said when he was on the Colbert Report, and it's a great line, he's like, reality has a well-known liberal bias. And it's true. And to the people who don't like my partisanship, I would just say this. If you dislike my partisanship, feel free to challenge the facts which have led me to be partisan. Maybe I'm wrong. I doubt it, but maybe I am. But if you're not prepared to challenge me on the facts, if you even tacitly agree with the facts, then as far as I'm concerned, you're obligated to accept the conclusion because I'm not going to change. So anyway, it's my thought on partisanship, or my thoughts on partisanship, rather. I hope it was illustrative. I hope it helps you understand better where I'm coming from. It's okay to be leftly partisan in today's political climate, and I don't think it's possible to be a good faith, informed, nonpartisan, because the facts don't support it. And you shouldn't grade the Republican Party and the regressive right on a curve simply because to not do so would make you feel like you've chosen a side. Sometimes in conflict, it's okay to choose a side. And I would say in 2023, in U.S. politics, you should. And that side that you should choose, in my opinion, is the progressive left and the Democratic Party.